welcome to Blue Cod's webinar titled Private Sector to Solve Public Sector Problem. My name is John Hughes, and I'm the Vice President of Blue Cod's Managed Business Services. I'm here today with Simon de Montfort Walker, Blue Cod's Executive Vice President of Operations, and he'll be leading our presentation today. Simon and I have both worked firsthand on establishing and managing the back office support for citizens takeout companies for a number of years. However, through our experiences working with these carriers, we have found that the assumption challenges could deter the startup community from taking advantage of otherwise profitable business opportunities. Our presentation today conveys Blue Cod's position that the properly resourced startup carrier could solve Florida's insurance crisis. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Simon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for joining us. I will apologize in advance for the sort of gruff fire dog voice I've got today, but hopefully it won't impede anyone understanding me. I think it's James has just chatted to everyone. If you've got questions or comments throughout the presentation, you could just drop them into the chat window to James Stolberg or to everyone for that matter. And we'll probably handle them all at the end of the discussion. And certainly, given the folks who've got signed up are all sounds very experienced in the Florida market, I think we'd love to certainly have some questions at the end and maybe even some discussion. So, our goal here is really to talk a little bit about what we see as some of the challenges, a few of the benefits that we see both in the startup universe as well as for end consumers in the state. And I think some of the challenges that we certainly see with both startup carriers that we work with the equity environment, that are looking to fund some of these carriers, and then just talk through a little bit about what we see as some of the solutions and certainly what we do, and then we'd love to have any questions that you've got and talk a little bit about those. So, I mean, I think given the folks on the line, we certainly all know how it all began. It's funny, we actually do a lot of work in the fair plan space, and we always seem to forget that Citizens is really just the largest fair plan in the country, but it's sort of grown so far beyond the normal course that it obviously looks incredibly different. I don't think we propose to know any more than anyone else in terms of really how things got to where they are, but it's certainly messy. All of these bills that we continue to see really continue to run into roadblocks, and it feels like we're all working at some level crosswise, whether it's sort of on the consumer side, on the legislative side, or on the private sector side. Our hope is that we feel as though there is a way through this. It might not be the most optimal, but really to bring and continue to encourage carriers to really work against citizens and bring policies out is really the best path. And I think our concern writ large, and many of the regulators that we speak to, many of the carriers that we speak to, is that at the end of the day, consumers in the state of Florida has really fundamentally been underserved, and we all seem at a loss to sort of fix this in a broad way. We spent a lot of time both with citizens and with the OIR and with regulators and legislators in Florida, and their heads and hearts are in the right place, but we're all sort of struggling to get this sorted out. And I think that's what brings us to the point of trying to sort out what is the right kind of syndicate of people, what is the right approach, and how do we kind of quickly help get the state off risk and frankly, continue to improve products in the state of Florida. So, one of the things that we work really dramatically on is trying to figure out ways that in very short order, typically sub 90 days, we can help carriers at the point of COA to take out policies and frankly be a fully formed and running carrier with a full back office. There's obviously lots of work before that, and so we actually spend a lot of time in our universe on the front end of this process, which is, there's a great opportunity here. There's really, not that it's uncontested, but it's near uncontested from a competitive standpoint. There's a way to get into what is a really should be an attractive market if you can get the expense ratios right in Florida. And there's certainly investors, especially right now as we see the Eurozone looking and struggling for dollar investments, to either engage in typical startup plays where, from our part, we and a series of our certainly incubate those carriers, or frankly for large out-of-state carriers that we deal with a lot and have as clients across our business who would like to frankly incubate into the Florida market without the large CapEx on the front end of the process, and come into the market and really have a go at it without the full force and weight of an internal investment to do so. I don't think anyone really argues that there's an interesting opportunity. I think we can debate what the right expense ratio is to get to a kind of good, secure, long-term model, but there's absolutely an opportunity to enter one of the great kind of insurance markets in Florida. We certainly see the regulatory and the legislative environment pushing for this and being really friendly to it, and the question is how to make it all happen. In terms of Citizens and the state of Florida, I think we've been, frankly, taken aback at the amount of national coverage we continue to see it getting. I think we've seen in the last 12 months probably 4 to 5 national editorials in the Journal and the New York Times on really the exposure that the state of Florida has. And there's lots of ways to sort of work through this and deal with this. There's the California model. Certainly in the rest of the southeast coastal states, people have taken different approaches, but the problem here is just so dramatically different that I don't think it's going to take anything other than a massive public and private partnership to really get this thing done. At the end of this, one of the most interesting things that we've seen, and I think we'd be interested if there's any comments on this at the end, the policies that consumers hold in the state of Florida right now are from a product perspective are probably arguably worse than they were 10 years ago. There's sort of less coverage. There's less really sort of bells and whistles around those coverages. You can debate whether people wanted them or not, but we've kind of materially harmed consumers. And certainly one of the roadblocks we see is that we just the consumer groups in the insurance industry haven't gotten together well enough to really kind of work together through this, and it seems certainly like an odd state of affairs to us. In terms of we know that in the private market, claims handling and policy handling tends to be kind of lower complaint ratio and a better experience for consumers. So I think everyone wants to get to this endpoint where we've got the private universe perhaps handling more of these. Everyone will benefit. The only question is how. Certainly, everyone loves to talk about capital being an issue, but we see it really being less and less of an issue. The question is what are the other roadblocks? As we work with carriers, and we're working with a number of them right now, we also work across the southeastern states. So we actually have experience on takeouts in multiple southeastern states beyond just Florida. The approval process, one core leg of the stool, is obviously incredibly difficult, and we see lots of well-intentioned people on either side of the table just getting to a point where I think we struggle to understand why folks aren't seeing COAs, where they're going awry. And so it's one of the areas that we certainly work and help our clients with. It takes really broad support from the back office universe, from the reinsurance side of affairs, as well as from the claims world. But it's something that we actually spend a lot of time on, and as part of our incubation model, this approval approach is really fundamental to us. In terms of the assumption, I mean, I feel like the most of our clients, certainly when they get to the point of doing an assumption, they feel as though the battle is won, but that process is exceedingly difficult. When we think about some of the opt-outs, as well as the process to get through to a policy that is where you're sitting on the risk, it's a really staggering process, and it still remains very, very technical. There's dramatic amount of sort of data and analysis that's required. It's gotten friendlier from what risk you take, but it's still a very difficult process, and it tends to pose the most challenge to the back office operating environment, as well as the technology stack, frankly, where being able to handle the analytics, being able to interact with agents and policyholders in a direct way, it tends to press very hard on traditional insurance infrastructure. Certainly, and again, I think we'd be interested to hear people's experience on the consumer side. There's a lot of sense, both in Tallahassee from what we can hear, as well as with carriers, that stability continues to be a concern, surplus continues to be a concern. I think from a pure policyholder perspective, we see less concern when we talk to the policyholders, when we talk to the consumer groups, but it still tends to be a final roadblock, and it's certainly been one of the biggest roadblocks from a legislative standpoint in the last few years. So, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've worked with multiple carriers, some of whom have come through, many of whom have not, and in the Florida marketplace, each one of these has been a gotcha for all of them. When we look at some of the other southeastern states, we see people really slide right through these in very, very short order. So it's a dichotomy that I think we struggle with, and we wish there was a solution for, frankly. And we think in some respects, kind of packaging up this process, making it look as similar as possible with a syndicate of players who are all doing their part is really the process to get there. And frankly, good takeouts with good policyholder interaction, good agent interaction. We've seen a few in the last few months, or one in the last few months, and I think it's bringing a lot of confidence to people where they actually are seeing really great interactions, frankly, and not some of the things we've seen in the past where they've been very, very messy interactions. So again, certainly both for startups as well as established carriers, these are the four items that we see as really core to the massive challenge ahead of people. And they're really the things that we spend a lot of time trying to solve for. Certainly the approval process, we can never be central to that, but from a lobbying perspective, from a stability perspective, low complaint ratios, all of the factual information, it is a dramatic set of issues, and we work really hard to solve those. And then the remainder of these things are, how do you convince the state, citizens, the OIR, that you're going to be a really good, solid, stable firm with really good, solid, stable agency and policyholder interactions that's going to manage and frankly kind of keep the ship afloat. And our perspective is that that's one of the last great challenges for most startup carriers, even established carriers doing a takeout, and it's something that people can trip on very, very easily, and it's certainly part of what we work really hard to solve. So from our perspective, we really work on bringing a best-in-practice processing framework and technology framework where we can bring policies to either an established carrier or a new carrier within the 90 days from a zero start and fold them into an environment that is already handling Florida-based policies, that is already handling with low complaint ratio, with really sort of solid best-in-breed servicing interactions, handling those policies. And so there's no downtick from the citizens' experience. Sometimes there's a dramatic uptick. We're really delivering kind of better web experience and frankly, stability in the operations, as well as a series of better sort of disaster mitigations around things like CAT handling, claims handling, all of the items that we worry about once we're kind of up and running and in flight. And from our perspective, these takeouts, whether you're an established carrier, whether you're a pure startup, whether you're an out-of-state carrier that's left the Florida market and want to dip your toe back in, this challenge remains the same for all carriers. They really are fundamentally even and equal across all of these types of firms. In terms of what we do, we really think about our business in terms of a managed services offering. Our goal is to help clients with very low capital expenditure either found a book of business, do a takeout, or start a carrier up with really full scale across both the technology and the processing side and really do it instantaneously. We have two components to our business. One is the business services side, which John, who introduced, manages. That is, frankly, a best-in-class back-office operation. We base it across multiple states in the U.S. and continue to have a Florida presence that we're actually increasing. Also beginning to move into front office out with underwriting. And then on the technical side, which the takeout process is incredibly intensive on technology, assuming policies, bringing those into a system, and frankly having it be a fully fledged policy management environment for billing, for claims, for handling interactions at renewal if Citizens is taking the first component. And that's really our managed technical services environment. And our goal, frankly, is to combine those two things on a per policy basis from a cost standpoint for our carriers with very low dollars up front, where we frankly share in the risk of making sure we drive really solid renewal rates, that we drive a good quality of business, so that those takeouts really drive good long-term revenues for our clients and are fundamental pieces of their business, whether they're both a voluntary business or not. In the coastal markets, we also offer a series of other services that are really specific. One is an incubation service where we work with a few partners both on the reinsurance side as well as on the claim side, and we have conversations with many others about how together we can really help investors form companies where they've got strong management teams but have a period of 4, 5, 6 months before they have a COA that they need assistance on fundamental accounting services, legal, and beginning to get the process of starting up a carrier in place. And so we actually provide those with a series of partners. We've done that in a number of cases. We have a pure managed assumption service, which is really, even if you don't want us to manage policies for you, I think for many of our clients, an assumption is actually very lumpy. Even if they've got a great policy admin environment, a great processing environment, it brings a lot of volume into an environment that might not want to or might drive a lot of costs. So we'll actually handle assumptions on a per policy basis and move those directly into our clients' operating environments. And then obviously there's our sort of bread and butter of really a full coastal homeowner solution, which we operate in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, as well as a number of other states along in the Northeast. And that is really a fully baked, it's an insurance carrier that doesn't carry risk, and that's what you do. So that's our business. I think part of our purpose to get really active and beginning to talk to people about the takeout opportunity and begin to talk about what's going on in the state of Florida is really, frankly, what else do we all need to be doing to move policies off the books at Citizens? We see great effort and frankly, a real cause célèbre in the legislature as well as in Citizens, with people working extraordinarily hard to make this happen. And part of our question to certainly the private sector is how do we all partner and help make that happen? And I think that's certainly, if we'd like to have, if anyone's got any questions or comments on that, we'd really love to hear them. I mean, this is intended to be a fairly short introduction to what we do, as well as an opportunity just to field any questions in terms of takeout services or any comments on the state and the state of business in general. So if there are any questions, we'll open them up to folks on the phone. You can just bring them in through chat to James Stolberg. We'll give you a second to think of any if you've got them. All right, so it looks like we've got 2 that have come in. John, do you want to just read them off to me?
We've got a couple. And Simon, I think these are going to be directed to you. The first one is, we're concerned that the takeout process is time-consuming and set up with some roadblocks. What's the partnership like with Blue Cod going through this process, and how are you going to help guide us as a carrier and work with us on the upfront time investment?
Sure. That almost sounds like a plant question, John. I think our experience is frankly that we're really here to be the sort of engine of making sure the processing happens, that you've got a compliant package of processes, tools, and infrastructure that you can take to the state, and the state will look at as something that's sort of experienced with handling Florida policies, that will not really drive any risk for them or give them a perception of risk. As well as, this is it's time-consuming, but it's also effort-laden. When we look at a typical takeout, clients of ours who have done them without us in the past, there's hundreds and thousands typically of hours of work to really get an understanding of what you're taking, what those look like, what the policies really need to do in terms of the operating environment, and we really take all of that off our client's shoulders. So our relationship typically looks like we'll do a price per policy for each assumed policy, whether it's sitting in our system or not, and typically right now Citizens is holding those policies, and we're just working claims before the first renewal. And then after that, we typically roll into a per policy fee per policy for full infrastructure as well as the handling of those policies.
Okay. The next question, does Citizens limit the amount of startup entrants per year, or do they limit the type of offerings?
I'm sure there's lots of people on the phone who have a sense of this. And I think the answer is technically no. There's certainly a series of windows to do these things. We don't see that as a limiting factor. The limiting factor is really the approval.
Okay. Next question that's come up is, could you discuss your relationship with the Florida key personnel in the financial and actuarial areas of the OIR?
Sure, and I think we obviously, like all outsourcers, our relationships are based on our clients' relationships. We've worked with and up and down the OIR in terms of approvals for rates and working on making sure that that all of those components, both on the actuarial side and the F&A side, are up to snuff. Look, there's a series of great partners that we have on the actuarial side who spend a lot of time working on that, and we really roll all of that into our offering. Our perception of the OIR is up and down. Everyone we interact with have actually been extraordinarily helpful and really want to push these processes forward. So I obviously won't name names, but we certainly work with the OIR. We certainly see in recent months, actually, even with the turnover they've had, just really a continuation of their dedication to make sure that they've got the right staff to answer some of those issues. On our side, we have both partners as well as in-house folks. Typically, our teams are all sort of 10 years plus in the P&C space, most of whom have sort of direct Florida experience with an operating company in the back office. And so those are relationships we typically bring to the table on top of the management teams we work with.
Okay.
I hope that answered the question.
The next question regarding the screening process for takeout with the Office of Insurance, what would your suggestions be to ensure that we have a clean first pass?
And I think this is one of the most sort of intensive processes because it's both an analytical exercise and it's a technical exercise where we're trying to gather the right data set, we're trying to analyze that data set, and so we don't have an issue with really having, basically sort of, almost poorly underwritten a book. Our perspective is that the first thing to solve for is really to get the data set normalized, bring in the right partners on the gathering side as well as on the actuarial side so that you can satisfy re-partners and make sure that you've got a really good holistic snapshot of what you're taking. Citizens has been extraordinarily good in terms of that interaction. And so, get the data normalization right first, and then everything really works extraordinarily cleanly after that. And it's just as we see in some respects in the voluntary market where, underwriting and data around how you look at underwriting and how you analyze it is becoming more and more important as people are getting more and more competitive. I think the case is the same here. It's just a little bit different where, these takeouts are competitive at some level, right? You want to make sure you take the highest quality book you can, and that exercise around data and analytics is fundamental. Without normalizing and having the right way to present that early on, it's an incredibly difficult exercise.
Now, the next question is, based on your experience with the OIR, do you believe the timeline as outlined is realistic, or should the expectations for startups be different? And once the process has started, have you found that Citizens is accommodating, or is it hard to work with them?
I think our perspective is we can absolutely work inside those dates. I mean, I know we hear a lot of people who have sort of concerns and issues with the time frames. I think it's really easy for us to say there's no problem with it because we've already got it all built, and we're sort of up and running, and we're really folding it into an infrastructure that we've already got. So I think if I were starting a new carrier without someone who had done it before, it probably feels like it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to get done. Our perspective is it absolutely makes sense. As long as you've done it before, you should be able to do it. And in some respects, we'd actually love them to tighten it because we think it adds value if we can very quickly get the selection process done and then move on to that risk and start taking unearned premium as early as we can. So I think there's actually a flip side to that.
Okay. At this point, it looks like we've taken all the questions as they are at the moment. Why don't we leave the line open for another moment to see if anything else comes in?
Sure. If there's any other questions, just put them on the chat window, and we'll discuss if there's any comments as well. It looks like there's nothing else coming in, so we'll thank you for joining us. We appreciated your time. If you have any follow-up, just communications@bluecod.com. We'll also certainly send everyone a link to any content we've got. We've also got a LinkedIn group on this subject if you're interested in continuing the conversation. So we really appreciate your time and look forward to continuing to engage on this and to solve the broader issue. Many thanks.